I'm Dr. Ben Muller. I teach at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario. In terms of the future in the European Union and the migration crisis, where are we going from here? I think at the moment, one of the issues we're seeing is the kind of vulnerability of the states that are on the boundaries of the EU and the extent to which it is very easy for kind of old and very exclusionary and kind of nasty politics to arise in those spaces, which is detrimental to the EU as a whole. And so that's one trend, and I think that as much as that's not something I'd want to see, I think we may see more of those kind of politics arising. The other aspect is, of course, the neighborhood policy, which I think is kind of a nicer way to talk about what most states are doing, which is trying to basically move risk further and further away from their own borders. In the case of the European Union, dealing with North African states, Turkey being obviously the really big case here, to try and keep the migration crisis at bay. But to an extent, this also, I think, is generally putting funds in places that are not necessarily the engines of change in those societies, because you are usually funding security, policing, and the kinds of parts of government that are usually not the most socially progressive. So I think there is a possibility for good things as well, but what we see on the periphery at the moment are kind of more, neo-fascistic kind of policies. And so I think it's a worry, and it's something that I don't think the neighborhood policy is going to properly deal with, because that's no different than what all states are doing, which is to say, keep the risk further and further away so we don't have to actually confront it on our own borders. So the comparative kind of lessons for a state like Canada from the EU, I think when it comes to borders, North America has always looked to the European Union as innovative and as kind of trailblazing in terms of Schengen and that whole experience of opening its borders. But the Fortress Europe reaction that we've seen more recently as a result of migration patterns, I think what Canada does learn in policy terms is this kind of neighborhood policy strategy of saying you need to look at other places from which migrants are coming and try to work with those governments and provide funding and so on. And that's definitely something that Canada is involved in. I think the other aspect is in terms of making more, robust systems for migration to be done legally, in terms of whether that's technologically aided through biometrics and things, but because Canada is so bound up in this North American model and a North American perimeter, I think it's very difficult to talk about anything to do with the Canadian border and Canadian migration in isolation without talking about the United States, which then, particularly under the current U.S. administration, brings with it a whole variety of other complications. And I think the kind of isolationist foreign policy stance of the U.S. has an impact on how the borders are perceived and how Canada is perceived in this arrangement. And we're kind of tied in through beyond the border and a variety of other agreements together. So I think there are positive and negative lessons to be learned from the EU experience with the migration crisis. I'm just not convinced how many of those lessons Canada is actually able to take on because of the way in which we're interconnected with the US.